In this section, we'll wrap up our discussion on different types of aircraft by making some comparisons, some pros and cons between passenger and all-cargo aircraft. Let's start off by talking about those passenger aircraft. Passenger aircraft offer a number of advantages for both importers and air freight forwarders. Some of them are a larger number of carriers to choose from. Depending on the city pairs, and if there's a lot of passenger traffic back and forth, there's just going to be more carriers to choose from. A bigger pool of carriers means more competition, which hopefully will drive down rates. Third sub-bullet point, there's a greater frequency of flights. There might not be as much cargo capacity, but certainly a greater frequency of flights as compared to all cargo aircraft. The other point that's kind of nice is a fixed flight schedule. It's a little bit easier to plan for putting cargo on passenger flights because they're tighter in terms of their departure and arrival times. We'll talk more about that on the cargo side of things, but a fixed flight schedule, it's just more dependable when passengers are involved. Some other advantages, because there is a fixed flight schedule, there's going to be fixed cutoff times as well. The cutoff time being the last time that a forwarder can tender cargo to an airline and make a booked flight. Another good point is that passenger aircraft have much more capacity than in the past. A perfect example is the 777 that we looked at previously. Third sub-bullet point, and this is something that doesn't get mentioned all that often, but passenger airlines, most of them at least, want the incremental revenue from cargo and are willing to negotiate rates aggressively. No carrier, be it a passenger airline or an all-cargo airline, wants empty space on their aircraft. Depending on the flight, the size of the aircraft, the city pairs, the time of year, there might be space on a passenger aircraft, and those passenger airline cargo salespeople are willing to negotiate a little bit more aggressively. Another advantage, last sub-bullet, is the ability to negotiate spot rates, where a freight forwarder, on behalf of an importer, or an exporter for that matter, can call an airline that has a flight at 6 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow and negotiate a rate on the spot based on space availability on that aircraft, on that flight, etc. Spot rate negotiations can be very competitive and save money for the importer. Some others. If we as an importer, or a freight forwarder for that matter, want to unitize our cargo, we can do so, albeit in smaller ULDs, like the LD3 that we saw briefly in the previous section. We have a whole multi-slide section on ULDs, pallets, containers, etc. Not to worry about that just yet. But an LD3 is a decent-sized unit loading device that can be used on passenger aircraft. Passenger aircraft can also handle temperature-controlled cargo. Usually, passenger airlines have a dedicated cargo sales staff. If they don't, they might use a general sales agent, which we defined several sections ago. And passenger airlines, because they're part of IATA, they basically have to be, they can use an electronic airway bill, which is a nice feature between the forwarder and the airline that only benefits the shipper, the importer. In the spirit of analyzing both pros and cons, let's look at some of the disadvantages associated with air imports via passenger aircraft. The first one, very real, is the possibility of freight getting bumped. And that just means that because of the limited cargo space on an aircraft, shipments that are received by an airline and are booked on a particular flight, they get bumped, they get left behind. Or, second sub-bullet point, shipments can be split up, meaning that 100 carton import coming in from Singapore going to Portland, Oregon, because of space and weight restrictions for cargo on a given flight, 50 might be sent on a flight today and 50 tomorrow. That's bad for U.S. importers for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes these passenger aircraft have to use flight connections. It's likely that that Singapore to Portland is not a direct flight, the one we spoke of just a moment ago. Maybe it stops in Seattle or LA or San Francisco and moves on to Portland. Flight connections are very real for passenger aircraft. The other point, and the cargo salespeople of passenger airlines don't talk about this too much, is that cargo is last on a passenger airline's what is referred to as an order of priority. What gets moved first? Let's elaborate on that in our next slide. Passenger airlines use what is called an order of priority for cargo. What moves first? And this is the list. Of course, passengers and their luggage. Mail, number 2. Perishables, number 3. Live animals, number 4. And cargo is number 5. Not only do passenger aircraft have limited space capabilities, but cargo is at the bottom of the list in terms of priority. That's pretty critical to know. First, on this slide, is the configuration of different aircraft. Different size aircraft have different capabilities for cargo space. A good air freight forwarder will know that. That's why it's so important for importers to work with solid, reliable, and knowledgeable freight forwarders. Limited weight capacity per piece. We saw weight capacity of 350 pounds. That's actually a lot. For passenger aircraft, it's much less. We talked a fair amount about limited dimensions per piece, the restrictions that we saw for height, for example, in the real-world cases we looked at. And although we can use smaller ULDs, like an LD3, it's difficult to unitize cargo using large unit loading devices. These are things that freight forwarders need to know. And we as importers have to work with forwarders that have that knowledge. Couple of others, and there's more than a few, as we can see. The simple fact is, although they'll never admit it, is that some airlines treat cargo as a non-priority. They'll take cargo as the gravy at the tail end of the flight to increase revenue, but it's not a big priority. There may also be limited customer service for forwarders through passenger airlines for cargo, and then a strict adherence to the limited liability terms and conditions, the T's and C's for moving cargo. Passenger airlines are pretty strict about that stuff. We're going to study what those T's and C's are in an upcoming section. Let's start to wrap up this section with the pros and cons for all cargo aircraft. All cargo carriers and their aircraft feature a number of advantages for air freight forwarders and importers. Number 1, the most obvious, cargo is their only business. Hopefully, they're going to pay attention to taking care of that business. They will have a dedicated sales and operational staff, will the all cargo carriers. They have a tendency to have a more extensive use of technology to remain competitive against other all cargo carriers, but also the passenger carriers. And another observation that can be made is that comprehensive on-the-ground physical plant is characteristic of all cargo carriers. We're talking about cargo handling facilities, bonded facilities, temperature-controlled areas, and also pharmaceutical and food-grade capacity. Because cargo is their only business, they have to be able to handle all different types of cargo, have the physical plant, the footprint, the buildings, the coolers, the freezers, material handling equipment, etc. These are all advantages to using all cargo carriers. A couple of other advantages, the aircraft are just bigger. Not so much in size, because a 777 can be a passenger aircraft and a freighter. But because we're dealing with all cargo carriers, there's more space, greater payload, and range of nautical miles. Usually, not always, all cargo carriers will run direct flights. Hong Kong to Los Angeles all day long. Frankfurt to JFK all day long. Good capacity in terms of direct flights. We can take full advantage of unit loading devices, these aircraft pallets, which again, we'll talk a lot about in upcoming slides, and also a willingness to negotiate different per kilo or per pallet rate structures. There's a bunch of different ways that forwarders can negotiate with all cargo carriers to the benefit of the U.S. importer. Some other advantages for all cargo carriers: a greater capacity for heavyweight freight, especially that can be nose loaded. There are fewer restrictions on cargo dimensions. For upper deck freight and a freighter, that 64-inch rule, not a big problem. All cargo carriers more willing to move hazardous cargo, and they focus on handling perishables, live animals, etc. What are some of the disadvantages of working with all cargo carriers? Well, number 1, a fewer number of available aircraft. Passenger flights are just more frequent than cargo flights. We have to be cognizant of that. Some all-cargo carriers only offer regional service, for example, Asia to the U.S. So if we as an importer move cargo from a bunch of different places, we might find ourselves working with forwarders that are working with different airlines. That's not necessarily bad, it's just a little more cumbersome from a management perspective. One little dark secret, or not so dark secret, for anyone that's been in the business for any amount of time, is the potential for flight delays or changes in schedule. Cargo aircraft aren't the same as passenger aircraft when it comes time to take off and land. The potential for delays is greater, or a change in the schedule. Some of those changes are legitimate. Maybe there's a weather issue. Maybe there's a mechanical problem with the aircraft. Many times, there are flight delays or changes in schedule due to a lack of cargo. The carrier can't fill the aircraft. They don't want to move it until they can make enough money to make it worth their while. Or they don't have the proper cargo mix, meaning a mix of dense and voluminous cargo, which again, we'll be talking about in upcoming sections. These are all things that airlines, shippers, and forwarders must be aware of, especially when dealing with all-cargo airlines. Some other considerations: the disadvantages to all-cargo aircraft. Per kilo rates may be higher than with passenger airlines. Emphasis on maybe, not always. Depends on the time of year, the city pairs, things of this nature. But when all cargo carriers have a lot of cargo and they have more freight than they do capacity on their aircraft, they can jack up the rates. Sometimes, second sub-bullet point, all cargo carriers cater more to larger air freight forwarders and or master loaders. That's indeed true, definitely out of Asia to the US and Asia to Europe. We want to be cognizant of that as well. And although not too frequent, some all-cargo carriers have their own forwarding arms, which essentially makes them competitors of the air freight forwarders that they sell to. That's another consideration. There's lots of pros and cons around passenger versus all-cargo aircraft. We just need to be aware of what they are and make the best use of our knowledge to the benefit of our air import program. All right, that wraps up this section. When we come back, as promised, we're going to be talking about unit loading devices. Lots of visuals, some pretty cool stuff. Do come back quickly.